Sometimes a single decision can tell you how much pain a person has survived, Daniel Brooks said quietly as he turned the thin silver ring beneath the yellow light of the pawn shop counter. The old jeweler frowned at him from across the glass display case. "You want it or not?" he muttered impatiently, but Daniel barely heard him. His eyes stayed fixed on the tiny engraving carved inside the ring. "Forever, Ethan." The words looked worn from years of being touched by nervous fingers. Daniel slowly lifted his gaze toward the rain-covered window at the front of the shop, watching the woman who had sold it only minutes earlier disappear into the storm with her shoulders curled against the cold. Something about the way she walked didn't look normal. It looked defeated. 3 days earlier, Emily Carter stood in the darkness of her apartment kitchen, listening to the soft hum of an empty refrigerator. The power bill was overdue again, and the electricity had been threatening to shut off all week. Outside, freezing November rain tapped against the cracked living room window while 8-year-old Noah sat wrapped in an old blue blanket on the couch, pretending not to cough. Emily opened the fridge slowly, already knowing what she would find. Half a carton of milk. 1 apple. Nothing else. She closed the door quietly and pressed her forehead against the cool metal for a moment. "Mom." Noah's small voice drifted across the room. "I'm not really hungry." Emily swallowed hard because that sentence hurt more every time he said it. Kids weren't supposed to know how to lie about hunger. She forced herself to smile as she walked over and brushed his blonde hair away from his forehead. He felt warm again. Too warm. "I'm gonna run out for a little while, okay?" she whispered. "Mrs. Green downstairs said she can keep an eye on you." Noah nodded weakly before looking toward her left hand. "Are you taking Dad's ring?" Emily instinctively covered the ring with her fingers. The silver band had once belonged to a happier version of her life. Before the hospital bills, before the funeral, before every paycheck started disappearing faster than she could earn it. Ethan had slipped that ring onto her finger 10 years earlier while shaking so badly he almost dropped it during their wedding vows. She could still hear his nervous laugh. Emily looked away quickly before the memory could crack her apart completely. "I'll be back soon," she whispered. 30 minutes later, she stood outside Benton's pawn shop with rain soaking through her coat sleeves. The glowing neon sign buzzed above her head while traffic splashed through puddles nearby. For several seconds, she couldn't make herself open the door. Her fingers trembled around the ring in her pocket. But then she remembered Noah's cough. The overdue rent notice sitting on the kitchen table. The empty refrigerator. And slowly, like someone walking toward the end of something they loved, Emily stepped inside. The smell of dust and old metal filled the tiny pawn shop as Emily stepped inside and pulled her soaked coat tighter around herself. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead made everything look pale and tired, including the rows of forgotten wedding bands, watches, and guitars sitting behind scratched glass cases. Somewhere in the back, an old radio played soft country music that sounded almost sad enough to match the weather outside. The owner, a heavy-set man with gray stubble and reading glasses hanging low on his nose, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Need to sell something?" he asked flatly. Emily hesitated before slowly reaching into her coat pocket. Her fingers wrapped around the ring for one final second before she placed it gently on the counter like something fragile enough to break from being touched too hard. The owner picked it up without emotion and examined it beneath a small lamp. "Silver," he muttered. "Tiny diamond. Old setting." Emily stayed silent while rubbing her freezing hands together. She hated being there, hated the shame burning inside her chest. The man pulled open a drawer and grabbed a magnifying glass. "Not worth much," he finally said. "I can do $12. Emily blinked as if she had heard him wrong. "12?" she whispered. The owner shrugged. "That is the market." Emily stared at the ring in his hand. 10 years of memories reduced to $12. She remembered Ethan saving money for months to buy it. He used to joke that he skipped lunch breaks for half a year just to afford something pretty enough for her hand. Back then, they were happy in a tiny apartment with cheap furniture and dreams that still felt possible. Emily swallowed hard and looked toward the front window before the tears in her eyes could fall. Across the room, a man stood near the old record shelf by the entrance. Tall, dark coat, quiet. He had walked in moments after her, but had not said a single word. Emily noticed him only because she could feel him watching the conversation unfold. Not with judgment. Something else. Something calm and unreadable. The owner pushed the ring slightly closer toward her. You want the 12 or not? Emily thought about Noah lying on the couch upstairs trying not to cough because medicine cost money. She thought about the empty refrigerator. The overdue rent notice folded beside the sink. Slowly, she nodded. Yes, she said softly. The owner counted out a wrinkled $10 bill and 2 singles before sliding them across the counter. Emily picked up the money carefully, almost embarrassed to touch it. Her wedding ring disappeared into the drawer with a soft metallic click that sounded much louder than it should have. For a second, Emily could not breathe. It felt like losing Ethan all over again. She quickly turned away before anyone could see the tears finally escape down her cheeks. As she reached the door, the quiet man near the entrance suddenly spoke for the first time. Wait. Emily froze. His voice was low and calm, the kind that made people instinctively listen. She slowly turned around. The stranger stepped closer to the counter and looked down at the ring still resting inside the open drawer. Then his eyes shifted toward Emily with an expression she could not understand. Where did you get this ring? He asked quietly. Emily tightened her grip on the damp bills in her hand as she stared at the stranger standing beside the counter. Up close, he looked older than she first thought, maybe late 30s, with tired eyes that seemed more observant than cold. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, and there was something unusually calm about the way he carried himself, like a man who had learned how to stay quiet in rooms filled with pain. The pawn shop owner looked annoyed by the interruption. Why do you care? He muttered while sliding the drawer halfway shut. But the man ignored him completely. His attention stayed on Emily. The ring, he repeated softly. Where did you get it? Emily hesitated. She did not owe this stranger an explanation, but something in his tone stopped her from walking away. It was my husband's, she answered quietly. Well, mine too. The stranger nodded slowly as though he had expected that answer. Then he held out his hand toward the pawn shop owner. Can I see it? The owner sighed dramatically before placing the ring into his palm. The stranger turned it beneath the light carefully, studying the engraving inside the band. His expression shifted for only a second, but Emily noticed it immediately. Recognition. You know something about it? She asked before she could stop herself. The man glanced at her, then back at the ring. Maybe, he said quietly. What was your husband's name? Emily looked down at the floor. Saying Ethan's name out loud still hurt more than she liked to admit. Ethan Carter. The stranger went still for a brief moment. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the rainy evening while headlights passed by the fogged front window. The pawn shop suddenly felt smaller and quieter than before. I am sorry, the man finally said. Emily forced a small nod. Life happens. But even as she said the words, she knew they sounded empty. Life had not just happened. Life had collapsed piece by piece until she barely recognized herself anymore. The stranger carefully placed the ring back onto the glass counter instead of handing it directly to the owner. How long ago did he pass away? Emily crossed her arms tightly against the cold. 2 years. And you sold this tonight because you needed money. It was not a question. Emily felt embarrassment crawl into her chest again. I do not really have the luxury of pride right now, she replied softly. For the first time, the man's face changed completely. Not pity, not judgment, regret, as though her words reached someplace personal inside him. The owner cleared his throat impatiently. Look, if nobody is buying anything else, I need to close up soon. The stranger reached into his coat pocket without taking his eyes off the ring. I will buy it. The owner blinked. For 12. No, the stranger said calmly. For 500. Emily's breath caught instantly. Even the owner looked stunned. $500 for this, he asked. The stranger nodded once. Cash. The owner quickly recovered from his shock and grinned greedily before taking the money the man pulled from his wallet. Emily stood frozen near the door, unable to understand what she was hearing. Nobody paid $500 for a worn silver ring in a pawn shop. Especially not a stranger. The man picked up the ring carefully after the sale was complete and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he looked at Emily again with the same unreadable expression. Take care of your son, he said softly. Emily's eyes widened. How did you know I have a son? But the stranger did not answer. He simply turned toward the rain-covered window and walked out into the storm, leaving Emily standing there with a strange feeling she could not explain growing heavier in her chest. Emily barely remembered the walk home through the rain. The stranger's voice kept replaying in her head over and over again. Take care of your son. She had never seen that man before in her life, yet somehow he knew about Noah. By the time she climbed the narrow apartment stairs to the third floor, her shoes were soaked through and her hands were numb from the cold. Mrs. Green stood waiting outside apartment 3B with her arms crossed tightly over her robe. Your little boy finally fell asleep. The older woman whispered gently. His cough sounds worse tonight. Emily thanked her softly before stepping inside the apartment. The heat barely worked, and the living room smelled faintly of instant soup and old radiator pipes. Noah lay curled beneath the blanket on the couch, his small chest rising slowly with each breath. Emily knelt beside him and brushed her fingers lightly against his forehead, still warm. Her stomach tightened with worry. She quietly placed the $12 onto the kitchen counter beside the extra cash she had left from the week before. $27 total. That was all she had in the world until payday 4 days away. Emily closed her eyes for a moment and tried not to cry again. The next morning arrived gray and freezing. Emily woke before sunrise and hurried across town for her first shift at a diner near the highway. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee clung to her clothes while customers rushed in from the cold complaining about traffic, weather, and long workdays. Emily smiled through all of it because tips mattered more than pride. Around noon, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. Lincoln Elementary School. Her heart dropped instantly. Mrs. Carter, the school nurse said gently. Noah has a fever again. You should probably come pick him up. Emily looked toward the crowded diner tables and then toward the clock above the kitchen window. She had already missed 2 shifts that month because Noah was sick. One more could cost her the job entirely. I will be there soon, she whispered anyway. 30 minutes later, she sat beside Noah on the city bus while snow mixed with rain against the windows outside. Noah leaned weakly against her shoulder, clutching his backpack. I am sorry, Mom, he mumbled quietly. Emily immediately shook her head. Do not ever apologize for being sick. Noah stared down at his shoes for a second. Did you really sell Dad's ring? The question hit her harder than she expected. Emily looked out the window before answering. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. Noah stayed quiet for a long moment. Dad would not be mad, he finally whispered. Emily felt tears burn behind her eyes again because Noah sounded so much like Ethan sometimes it hurt to breathe. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table surrounded by overdue bills while the apartment creaked softly in the winter wind. Her landlord had taped another warning notice to the front door earlier that afternoon. Final reminder. Rent overdue. Emily rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her calculator before stopping suddenly. Something felt wrong. She slowly looked toward the dark apartment window above the sink. Across the street, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, sat a black SUV she did not recognize. The engine was running softly despite the cold. Emily frowned slightly. For a brief second, she thought she saw the outline of someone sitting inside watching the building. Then the headlights switched on, and the vehicle quietly disappeared into the snowy night. 3 days later, Emily stood in the pharmacy aisle comparing medicine prices with only $19 left in her wallet. Noah's cough had become deeper overnight, and the school nurse warned her that he needed proper antibiotics soon if the fever continued. Emily stared at the tiny price tags beneath the bottles while mentally calculating which bills could wait another week. Rent was already late. The electricity notice sat unopened on the kitchen table because she already knew what it said. Everything in her life felt like a countdown she could not stop. Mom, Noah tugged softly on her sleeve beside the shopping cart. Can we get the grape one? Emily looked down at him and forced a smile. Maybe next time, sweetheart. Noah nodded without complaining, and somehow that made her feel even worse. Most children begged for toys or candy. Noah had learned how to stay quiet around money. As Emily reached for the cheaper medicine on the bottom shelf, she noticed movement through the front pharmacy window. Across the parking lot, parked beside a snow-covered pickup truck, sat the same black SUV from outside her apartment building. Her hand froze instantly. The windows were tinted dark, but she knew it was the same vehicle. A strange chill moved through her chest. She quickly looked away and grabbed Noah's hand. Come on, she whispered. They paid for the medicine and left quickly, but when Emily stepped into the freezing air outside, the SUV was already gone. That night, after Noah finally fell asleep, Emily sat alone beside the kitchen window, drinking instant coffee gone cold hours earlier. Snow drifted slowly beneath the streetlights outside, while the old radiator hissed unevenly. Behind her, her exhaustion had reached the point where even thinking felt heavy. She picked up an old framed photograph from the table beside the couch. Ethan stood smiling beside her on their wedding day with one arm wrapped around her waist while she laughed at something he whispered moments before the camera flashed. Back then, the future still looked bright. Ethan used to tell her they would someday buy a small house with a porch swing and a backyard big enough for Noah to run around in. Emily touched the corner of the photograph gently. "I am trying," she whispered into the silence. "I really am." The next afternoon, Emily finished her diner shift just after 4 o'clock. Snow crunched beneath her shoes as she walked toward the bus stop, pulling her thin coat tighter against the bitter wind. Halfway down the block, she noticed someone standing outside a small coffee shop across the street. Tall, dark coat, hands in his pockets. Daniel Brooks. Emily stopped walking immediately. He did not wave or call out to her. He simply stood there calmly like he had been waiting. Cars passed between them, while steam curled from the coffee shop vents overhead. Emily slowly crossed the street with confusion tightening in her chest. "Why are you following me?" she asked the moment she reached him. Daniel looked tired, almost like he had not slept much in days. "I needed to make sure you were real," he answered quietly. Emily frowned. "What does that even mean?" Daniel glanced toward the diner behind her before lowering his voice. "That ring belonged to someone connected to my family." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "You bought it for $500 because of family history?" Daniel hesitated for a second too long. "Partly." Snowflakes landed quietly on the shoulders of his coat, while Emily searched his face for answers. "Then what is the other reason?" she asked softly. Daniel looked directly at her, and for the first time since meeting him, his calm expression cracked just enough to reveal something deeper underneath. "Guilt." Emily stared at Daniel while freezing wine swept between them on the crowded sidewalk. People hurried past carrying shopping bags and hot coffee, but for a moment the noise around them seemed distant. "Guilt?" she repeated quietly. Daniel looked away toward the snowy street as if searching for the right words somewhere beyond the passing traffic. "My father used to make custom jewelry," he finally said. "Small business. Nothing glamorous. But he cared about every piece he designed." Emily crossed her arms tightly against the cold. "What does that have to do with Ethan's ring?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out the silver band. Even beneath the gray winter sky, the tiny diamond still caught the light. Emily felt her chest tighten the moment she saw it again. Daniel carefully turned the ring over in his hand. "My father made this ring almost 11 years ago," he said softly. "I recognized the engraving style immediately." Emily frowned in confusion. "That is impossible." "It is not." Daniel's voice stayed calm, but something heavy sat behind it now. "My father kept records of every custom piece he ever made. Names, dates, personal notes." Emily looked down at the ring, trembling slightly in his palm. "Ethan saved for months to buy it," she whispered. "I know," Daniel replied. "My father wrote about him." Emily slowly looked back up at him. Daniel gave a faint nod before continuing. "He wrote that Ethan came into the shop 6 different times because he could not afford the design he wanted for you. My father offered cheaper options, but Ethan refused. He said if he was only buying one wedding ring in his life, it had to be perfect." Emily suddenly felt tears sting her eyes again. That sounded exactly like Ethan. Stubborn, loving, determined. Daniel continued quietly. "The last time Ethan visited the shop, he brought a small jar filled with loose coins and wrinkled bills. My father said he counted every dollar by hand while apologizing for being short by 38 cents. Emily covered her mouth as emotion rushed through her chest. For years she had worn that ring without knowing the full story behind it. Daniel glanced down at the band again before speaking more softly. "My father paid the difference himself." Snowflakes drifted silently around them while Emily struggled to steady her breathing. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "Because after my father passed away, I inherited his journals." Emily looked at him carefully now. The guilt in his eyes suddenly made more sense, but not completely. "You still have not explained why you have been following me." Daniel stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he finally admitted the truth. "Because when I saw you sell that ring for $12, it reminded me of my mother." Emily frowned slightly. Daniel shoved one hand into his coat pocket as though trying to warm himself against an older kind of cold. My father died when I was 10, he said quietly. After that, my mother sold almost everything we owned just to keep food on the table. Jewelry, furniture, family photographs. I still remember watching her walk out of pawn shops, trying to pretend she was not crying. Emily's expression softened instantly. Daniel gave a small, humorless laugh beneath his breath. I spent years becoming successful because I promised myself I would never live like that again. But somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing people who still did. He looked directly at Emily now, his voice quieter than before. Then I saw you standing in that pawn shop holding the last thing your husband ever gave you. Emily could not speak. Daniel carefully held the ring out toward her, and I realized I should have done something sooner. Emily stared at the ring resting in Daniel's open hand while snow drifted quietly around them beneath the fading afternoon sky. For a moment, she could not move. The silver band looked exactly the same as the day Ethan slipped it onto her finger, but somehow it felt heavier now, carrying memories she had forgotten and truths she never knew existed. I cannot take it back, she whispered finally. Daniel frowned slightly. Why not? Emily let out a tired breath and looked down at the icy sidewalk beneath her boots. Because I sold it. Her voice cracked softly on the last word. I made that choice. Daniel closed his fingers gently around the ring. You made a sacrifice, he corrected quietly. Emily shook her head. No, I failed. Daniel's expression tightened. Immediately. Do not say that. Why not? Emily looked up at him now, emotion finally spilling through the exhaustion she had spent months trying to hide. I cannot pay my rent on time. My son is sick. I work every hour they give me, and somehow it is still never enough. Her breathing trembled slightly in the cold air. Good mothers are supposed to protect their children from this kind of life. Daniel stayed silent, listening carefully. Emily laughed weakly, though there was no humor in it at all. Noah pretends he is not hungry because he thinks it makes things easier for me. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment as though her words physically hurt to hear. Cars rolled past behind them while Christmas decorations blinked softly in nearby storefront windows. The whole city looked warm and festive except for the two of them standing in the cold, carrying conversations neither one expected to have. Finally, Daniel spoke again. My mother used to skip dinner and tell me she already ate at work. Emily looked at him quietly. I believed her for years, he continued softly. Then one night, I woke up and found her sitting at the kitchen table drinking water because it made her stomach feel less empty. Emily felt her chest tighten painfully. Daniel looked toward the street before speaking again. Children remember things like that. Not because they blame their parents. Because they never forget who kept trying. Emily blinked quickly, fighting tears she no longer had energy to hide. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Snow continued falling around them, while evening lights slowly flickered on across the city. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small white business card. Come see me tomorrow, he said quietly. Emily looked down at the card. Brooks Restoration Group. Downtown office address. Why? She asked carefully. Because I have a job opening. Emily immediately stiffened. I am not asking for charity. Neither did my mother, Daniel replied calmly. Emily looked back at him, unsure what to say. Daniel continued. The position pays better than the diner. Regular hours. Health insurance after 90 days. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You do not even know me. I know enough. His voice stayed steady and sincere. I know you sold the last valuable thing you owned instead of giving up. Most people would not survive what you already have. Emily felt overwhelmed by how serious he sounded. She glanced down at the business card again before speaking softly. Why are you doing this for me? Daniel looked at the ring still resting in his hand. Because somebody once helped my mother when we had nothing, he answered quietly. And she spent the rest of her life telling me that kindness only matters if you pass it on. Emily stood frozen for a moment as wind swept snow across the sidewalk between them. Then, very carefully, Daniel took her hand and placed the silver ring back into her palm. Emily stood motionless after Daniel walked away into the falling snow, her fingers wrapped tightly around the ring resting in her palm. For the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar pushing through the exhaustion inside her chest. Not happiness exactly. Something smaller. Fragile. Hope. The next morning, she almost did not go to the address on the business card. She sat at the kitchen table staring at it while Noah ate dry cereal from a chipped bowl beside her. "What is that?" Noah asked curiously. Emily hesitated. "Maybe a job interview." Noah's tired little face brightened instantly. "A better one." Emily smiled faintly. "Maybe." Noah looked down at the silver ring now back on her finger. "Dad would like that." Emily swallowed hard before standing up and pulling on her coat. Brooks Restoration Group occupied the top 3 floors of a modern office building downtown overlooking the river. Emily felt painfully out of place the second she stepped into the marble lobby with her worn boots and discount store coat. Men in expensive suits moved quickly through the elevators carrying leather briefcases while receptionists answered calls behind polished white desks. Emily almost turned around twice before finally approaching the front counter. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked politely. Emily nervously handed over the business card. "I am here to see Daniel Brooks." The receptionist's expression changed immediately. "One moment, please." Less than 2 minutes later, Emily was being escorted upstairs to a quiet office lined with large windows and shelves filled with architecture books and framed photographs of restored buildings. Daniel stood near the window speaking on the phone when she entered. He looked different here. More polished, more powerful, but somehow still just as tired around the eyes. He ended the call quickly and motioned for her to sit down. "I was not sure you would come," he admitted. Emily sat carefully in the chair across from his desk. "I almost did not." Daniel nodded as though he understood completely. Then he slid a folder across the desk toward her. "Customer Relations Coordinator," he explained. "Mostly scheduling, client communication, and organizing restoration projects." Emily looked through the paperwork slowly. The salary was almost double what she earned at the diner. Health insurance, paid sick days, regular hours. Her throat tightened immediately. "Daniel, you are qualified," he interrupted gently. "I checked." Emily looked up in surprise. Daniel gave a small apologetic smile. "You managed office scheduling at Ethan's construction company before he got sick." Emily stared at him quietly. "You really did investigate me. Only enough to know whether this would help or offend you." Emily looked back down at the paperwork. She could hardly process what she was seeing. For months her life had felt like sinking underwater 1 inch at a time. And now suddenly someone was offering her air before she drowned completely. "Why me?" she whispered again. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, thoughtful for a moment before answering. "Because success means nothing if it only changes your own life." His voice stayed calm, but deeply sincere. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms until her hands gave out. One person gave her a chance when nobody else cared enough to look twice." He paused briefly. "I never forgot that." Emily lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by emotion she no longer knew how to handle. Daniel reached toward the folder and tapped the final page softly. "You do not owe me gratitude," he said quietly. "Just promise me something." Emily looked up. "What?" Daniel's expression softened slightly. "When life finally becomes easier again, and it will, do not forget what it felt like to struggle. People survive hard times easier when somebody sees them." Emily felt tears gather in her eyes once more, but this time they did not come from shame. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the pen resting beside the folder and signed her name. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the wide front windows of Carter Home Restoration on a quiet Saturday morning, while Emily laughed softly behind the reception desk at something Noah said about his baseball coach. The small office smelled like fresh coffee, sawdust, and paint samples, and for the first time in years, her life no longer felt like survival. Framed renovation photos lined the walls beside project blueprints and customer thank you cards. Emily still worked for Brooks Restoration Group, but 6 months earlier Daniel helped her open a smaller community branch focused on restoring older family homes across the county. She had almost refused at first, convinced she was not capable of managing something so important. Daniel simply smiled and told her that strong people usually underestimated themselves the most. Noah burst through the office carrying his baseball glove with flushed cheeks and bright eyes that no longer looked tired all the time. His cough was gone now. The dark circles beneath his eyes had disappeared months ago after regular doctor visits. Proper medicine and steady meals became normal parts of life instead of impossible luxuries. "Mom, Coach said I might start next weekend," Noah announced proudly. Emily grinned and reached over to straighten his crooked jacket collar. I told you all those extra practices would pay off. Noah noticed the silver ring hanging from the thin necklace chain around her neck and smiled. You still wear it every day. Emily touched the ring gently with her fingertips. Always. She no longer wore it on her hand. Somehow the necklace felt closer to her heart there. A soft knock sounded against the open office door a few seconds later. Emily looked up and smiled immediately. Daniel stood outside holding 2 coffee cups while snow drifted lightly through the town square behind him. Some things about him had not changed at all over the past year. He still wore dark coats, still looked thoughtful even when smiling, still carried that quiet sadness around the eyes that came from remembering difficult things too clearly. But now, when he walked into the office, Noah ran straight toward him without hesitation. Daniel! Noah shouted excitedly. Daniel laughed softly as Noah nearly collided into him. Easy there, buddy. He handed 1 coffee to Emily before glancing around the office proudly. Looks busy in here. Emily looked toward the stack of renovation folders waiting on her desk and smiled. Busy is good. Daniel nodded quietly. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there watching Noah excitedly explain baseball statistics neither adult fully understood. Then Emily looked at Daniel more seriously. You changed our lives. Daniel immediately shook his head. No, I gave you an opportunity. You changed your own life. Emily felt emotion tighten gently in her chest, because deep down she knew he truly believed that. Daniel had never treated her like someone broken or helpless. He treated her like someone worth believing in before she remembered how to believe in herself again. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled softly across the snowy streets, while people hurried between shops carrying wrapped gifts and warm drinks. A year ago, Emily had stood in a freezing pawn shop convinced her entire life was falling apart. Now she stood inside a future she once thought belonged only to other people. Noah suddenly looked up at her with a grin. Mom, yeah, Dad would really like Daniel. Emily glanced toward Daniel, who looked slightly embarrassed by the comment. Then she smiled softly and touched the ring resting against her chest once more. I think you are right, she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, the memory of Ethan no longer felt tied only to loss. It felt tied to the strange and beautiful truth that sometimes, when people are at their absolute lowest, life still finds quiet ways to give them hope back.